obligations. However, we in the West were convinced that because there'd been this clandestine activity, and because we did know that there had been, that the military, if you like, had been carrying out research separately into how to make a nuclear weapon, we decided that Iran must be is hell-bent, if you like, on acquiring nuclear weapons. Were very worried about that, perfectly legitimately, if you like, and we set about trying to persuade the Iranians to give up all their enrichment activities. We did this initially in what I would consider to be a very acceptable way. We negotiated with them. You may, some of you remember, that between 2003 and 2005 there was a negotiating process which Jack Straw launched when he went to Tehran in October 2003. I was involved in that process. We really got to know the Iranian negotiators well, and we were on very cordial terms with them, not matey, but good relations of a diplomatic kind. And I think we built up a certain amount of trust. But very sadly, this process collapsed because although the Iranians made us a very good offer, they said, look, we'll restrict our enrichment activities to a very small amount. We just really want to continue learning about this process. But we won't produce large quantities of even low enriched uranium, certainly no high enriched uranium. And the IEA can have a permanent on-site presence at all the important sites. So this was a very good offer. I won't go into all the other details. But we said no, because the Americans and the Israelis had said to us that they couldn't, under any circumstances, countenance any kind of enrichment activity in Iran. It would just be too risky. These were dreadful people, they were evil, they were fanatical. If we allowed them to have any kind of enrichment capability, before we knew it, they'd have nuclear weapons and they'd be destroying Israel. So that process collapsed, and after it collapsed, we set about on the alternative course, which was to refer Iran to the Security Council in New York and to get the Security Council to pass a succession of resolutions which impose sanctions on Iran, a progressively heavier burden of sanctions. Our belief being that somehow if we just made life difficult enough for them, and sanctions is a rather sort of easy word, isn't it? But what this really means is economic warfare. We declared a kind of economic warfare on them, and we thought that we could cripple them through this economic warfare, and they would come pleading to us to stop, and would say, we'll do whatever you do, whatever you want, just as long as you stop. Of course, things haven't worked out that way. Now, my contention has been that Western policy should have changed as far back as 2008. Instead, it's remained unchanged. It should have changed as far back as 2008 because that was when the American intelligence community, for the first time, told the world that they had good reason to believe that actually, after all, Iran wasn't trying to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran was merely trying to put together the capability to make nuclear weapons if at some point in the future it felt threatened and wanted to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it would be allowed to do, and make nuclear weapons in order to defend itself. I should have really said this at the beginning, I had intended to. There is this distinction under the treaty between making weapons, which is absolutely prohibited, and conducting basic research and acquiring a civil uranium enrichment capability so that if ever there was a threat, you would be able to withdraw and make weapons. Everyone knows that the Japanese, the Germans, the Dutch, the Brazilians, the Argentines, and there may be others, have this latent capability to make nuclear weapons. But no one raises a fuss about any of that. And the likelihood is that that's really what Iran is after too. After all, this is a country that's been threatened many times in the course of its history. It's rather vulnerable. I think it has a more common border. I mean, it has a common border with more neighbours than almost any other country, apart perhaps from Russia. So it does feel a bit vulnerable, but it knows that as a party to the NPT, it is not allowed to actually acquire nuclear weapons. So we should really have been changing our policy as far back as 2008, since it has become inappropriate, if you like, given this new intelligence assessment. We haven't changed it. Why? I think lots of factors. First of all, the Israeli influence. The Israelis continue and have continued and still continue to say that we can't trust the Iranians with any kind of enrichment capability. And I suppose you can sort of half understand why the Israelis feel that way, because after all, it is a very small state. A couple of Iranian nuclear weapons could probably obliterate Israel. But there's absolutely no evidence that actually Iran wants to obliterate Israel. All these attacks on Israel are purely rhetorical, and as I said earlier, for 13 years they went on, and the Israelis scarcely raised an eyebrow. They also, in the process of obliterating Israel, they would kill a great many Palestinians, which wouldn't go down very well in the Arab world. And also, of course, Iran's leaders are not idiots, and they know that if they were to obliterate Israel, they in turn would be obliterated by the United States. And these are not suicidal fanatics, very far from it. They're people who like the good life. They drink, they have cars, they're allowed to marry several wives. The pleasures of the flesh are not alien to them. And there's much more I could say on that score, but never mind. So I think, there's this Israeli factor continues to be very important. There's also a Saudi factor. I don't think the Saudis are as scared as the Israelis that at some point in the future Iran might destroy them, but they've long seen Iran as great rivals. Iranians are Shia, Saudis are Sunni. Saudis know that Iranians fundamentally rather despise Arabs, and of course none of us like being despised. They have a sense of rivalry, and add to which the Saudi monarchy feels very insecure. It really is a rather illegitimate regime, and what it did in 1924 when it seized the holy places in Medina and Mecca from the Hashemites was extremely illegitimate. So they have the kind of insecurity, if you like, of people who know that they haven't got an entirely clean record. And they have certainly exerted a lot of influence on Washington and on London and one or two other European capitals to try and keep us feeling hostile and suspicious towards Iranians. Then we had, in America under President Bush, we had the groups known as the neocons. I'm sure you've all heard of them. And they wanted to totally reshape the Middle East. They thought they were entitled to have this grand vision, and it would be jolly good for the people of the region if they just allowed the neocons to sort them all out and create a new Middle East. And part of that vision for sorting out the Middle East involved regime change in Iran. So the nuclear issue became a convenient vehicle for promoting this goal of regime change. Then you've of course got the sense of grievance among ordinary Americans generated by the hostage crisis and several other episodes that have been certainly damaging to American interests, for which the blame does indeed lie at Iranian door. But what Americans tend to forget is that they've also given a lot of offence to Iranians. America did not condemn Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq in 1980. America gave quiet, tacit, underhand support to Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. In 1987 or 88, when a US warship, the USS Vincennes, shot down an Iranian civil airliner leading to the death of 290 people, This was apparently a mistake. I think it probably was a mistake. And the Americans did, I think, apologize, but the next thing they did was award a medal to the captain of that vessel, which the Iranians could be forgiven for finding a little bit tactless and maladroit. And then in 1991, after the Iranians had really been quite helpful to the Americans by securing the release of American hostages in Lebanon, the Americans excluded them from the Madrid Middle East peace process. And the Iranians found that a little bit offensive, since, like any self-respecting state, they want to have a certain amount of influence over regional affairs. I think that's understandable. And then of course almost the most grievous offence of all was after there were lots of meetings in the autumn of 2001 between Americans and Iranians, because the Iranians were genuinely sympathetic after 9/11 and offered to help the Americans in Afghanistan because the Iranians hated the Taliban. And they did indeed offer lots of help, and as I say, both sides got on perfectly well. And what happens in the State of the Union speech in January 2002, President George Bush qualifies Iran's leaders as evil. So that also left a bad taste in the mouth. Anyway, I was really trying to explain why our policy hasn't changed. So my emphasis was more on the American sense of grievance. I think there's, let's see, what else have I got here that needs to be said? Well, it undoubtedly doesn't help at all, of course, that the Iranian human rights record is bad. It's not good. I mean, there are many regimes some regimes out there that have even worse records. And personally, I don't think you can afford to mix human rights and nuclear issues, because the nuclear area issue is just so sensitive and potentially destructive that you've just got to take it apart and solve it on its merits and keep a cool head. But nonetheless, people's thoughts and feelings certainly do get influenced when they read about the horrid things that the Iranian government does to its own people. And then you'll remember in 2009 there was this contested election result, and the repression of demonstrations in the street that took place after that. That also was pretty unforgivable, yes, unacceptable, and unforgivable I wouldn't say, but unacceptable, and created a very bad impression. And then you get, I think this almost should have come sooner because it's a vital point. There's this widespread feeling in the West that you just can't trust Iranians. These are wily Orientals. Their religion allows them to tell lies. They're very untrustworthy. And this is partly natural, actually, because how many Iranians do most Westerners know? And of course there have been occasions in the past where Iranians haven't behaved in an altogether trustworthy way. But there's also a tendency to forget that we used to say just the same thing about the Russians during the Cold War. We used to say you can't trust a Russian, you can't possibly do any kind of deal with the Russians. But we were cleverer in those days, more intelligent, and what the solution to that was to negotiate arms control agreements with Russia, which contained provisions for verifying the agreement, so that we would very quickly find out if ever the Russians weren't honouring their side of the agreement. And what this meant was that as the years passed and we realised that actually the Russians were honouring their side of the agreement, slowly but surely we began to have more confidence in the trustworthiness of Russians. And that's exactly what we ought to be doing with the Iranians, instead of which we're saying, no, we can't negotiate anything with them because they're not trustworthy. Sorry, I'm not always being very diplomatic, but now, why